We really want to thank you, Edward Fishman, for joining us. It's a pleasure having you here, and it's been so nice getting to know you before the panel starts. For everybody else, welcome. We appreciate you joining us. For a little bit of background on who Edward Fishman is, he's a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council, which is one of the top think tanks in Washington, D.C., in the United States, and even in the world. He's also an adjunct fellow at the Center for a New American Security. His research focuses on Europe, Russia, the future of the international the international order and economic sanctions. From 2015 to 2017, Mr. Fishman served at the US Department of State as a member of the Secretary of State's policy planning staff. In that role, Mr. Fishman advised Secretary of State John Kerry on Europe and Eurasia. All of this experience make him one of the best to analyze and enlighten us or give us insights of what's coming after the coronavirus pandemic. He argues that the world order is dead and that it's time to build a new one. Will the United States be there? Let's see what Edward Fishman, Eddie, if you are a friend of him, thinks. Okay, the floor is yours, and thank you so much again.
Well, Alex, thank you for that really kind introduction. I will go ahead and share my screen and would love for you to just confirm that you can see it once I've done so. How's it look?
We do. Looks
Got it?
Yes.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much for the kind introduction, Alex. And I have to admit, I've been really excited for this talk today for a few reasons. And I think that the main one is, it's not that common that I have the opportunity to talk to such a diverse and international group. And, after my presentation, I'm really looking forward to both taking your questions, but also hearing your own thoughts, because obviously my perspective is shaped by the fact that I'm an American, I live in the United States. I know many of you also live here, but, come from other countries. So I'm really excited for the conversation. So I want to frame our discussion really with a question. I'm sure like many of you, I've also been sort of just at my home for the last few months, and it's hard not to just think about our own personal lives and to think about when can we go back to our favorite coffee shop or when can we go to our favorite restaurant. But today I really want to look beyond the pandemic, beyond this period that we're in now, and ask this broad question about what world will emerge as the pandemic recedes. What will the world look like? And sort of a subsidiary question to that is, what can US leaders and international leaders as well do today to ensure that the world to come is conducive to peace and prosperity? So really, the hope of today's conversation is to look beyond the pandemic and to try to understand what type of geopolitical trends and also other sort of trends in our societies we can expect to see. So before diving in, I want to just set an agenda because I want everyone to be able to manage their energy for today. So the first thing we're going to do is just talk about international orders, what they are, because if we don't all agree on what sort of an international order is, it's difficult for us to have a cohesive conversation. After that, we're going to talk about why the coronavirus will be a transition point. This is a really important question because there's a school of thought that thinks that COVID won't be a transition point. After that, we're going to dive into the history lessons of the last two transitions between international orders in 1919 and 1945. And finally, we're going to look at what the post-coronavirus order could look like. So starting with International Orders 101. So what is an international order? International orders define how countries interact with each other and how individuals interact with the world. So they both are important in terms of defining how countries and how their foreign policies interact, but also individuals. Can you travel freely between countries? Can you do business freely between countries? So that's really the definition that we're going to use today. And they're building blocks of international orders. The three key building blocks are norms, treaties, and institutions. So norms are probably the most important, but also the least tangible. Their habits of cooperation, habits of behavior, and then also sort of just general notions of right and wrong. Treaties, as you probably have heard, are laws and other sort of types of international agreements that enforce those norms. And then countries create institutions really as standing mechanisms to enforce those norms, because unlike obviously national governments, which have the power of law and can put you in jail if you break the law, that doesn't exist obviously in the international system. And so we need institutions to come together, bring countries together to enforce the norms. So one interesting sort of historical point that I think is really the framing point for this whole conversation today is that once these webs of norms, institutions, and treaties, these international orders form, they tend to last a very, very long time. They tend to be built in sort of short bursts of energy after global conflagrations or global crises, but then can be enduring for decades or even centuries. So just to look back at the last sort of 200 years of international orders, after the French Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars, which roiled Europe for more than 2 decades, we had the Congress of Vienna, which sort of set the order in Europe that really persisted for most of the 19th century. So that order that emerged from the Congress of Vienna went through some sort of subtle changes, of course, with the revolutions of 1848, the Crimean War, the unification of Germany in 1871, but truly it didn't unravel fully until the outbreak of World War I in 1914. So that's 99 years that the world lived under this order that came out of the Congress of Vienna. And then after World War I, we had another order that was built. This is the Paris Peace Conference. See the photo here from the hall, or sorry, a painting here from the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles with Woodrow Wilson, Georges Clemenceau, David Lloyd George, and other leaders. And this order that came out of the 1919 Paris Peace Conference is sort of historically regarded as a very unsuccessful order. It sort of didn't really prepare the interwar period or prepare the sort of post-war period, which became known as the interwar period, of course, for the challenges that it would face. And even though it was a failure, it lasted all the way up until 1939, the outbreak of World War II. So even this sort of ephemeral order was still 20 years, quite a long period of time. And then finally, the order that we've all sort of grown up in, that we sort of have lived under for all of our lives, I would imagine, is the order that came out of World War II. This photo that you see here of Winston Churchill, FDR, and Stalin from the Yalta Conference is just one of many sort of these post-war conferences that set in motion what sometimes is called the liberal world order, the liberal international order that we've lived under for over 70 years. But we're now potentially at another turning point. We have seen truly a world-shaping crisis in COVID-19 that has touched all of our lives and really arrested the world simultaneously in a way that no other historical crisis has done. And it's hard to imagine the world looking the same as it did before a crisis of this magnitude, both in terms of the health outcomes and really the tragedies that it's wrought in all of our countries, the economic dislocation that it's created. But I think above all really is this collapse sort of in our faith in our own institutions to be able to keep us safe and to keep our economy strong and our people healthy. So the question we have today is, will 2020 be a turning point? Will we wind up remembering 2020 as one of these breaking points like 1919 or 1945 that we've discussed earlier in this presentation? So, my opinion, I guess, is probably clear by the title of this next section, why the coronavirus pandemic will be a transition point. So I want to emphasize that really smart people disagree with me on this. Some people think that, COVID actually won't change the world order and we'll just wind up sort of muddling along with the liberal order that we had post 1945. I really disagree with that. And that's sort of one of the real cornerstones of my argument that I'm happy to discuss in the Q&A. But for now, I want to just go through really why I'm very convinced that this is going to be a transition point. And really, it comes down to what world orders rest on, and that's confidence. So, world orders truly are only as valuable as the confidence that countries ascribe to them. the G20 or the G7 or the UN or any of these alphabet soup of institutions, they ultimately are just empty shells unless governments decide to use them to address real problems. And norms, of course, are only valuable insofar as people subscribe to them and whether countries actually abide by norms, right? So without that confidence, a world order really doesn't have much weight. It doesn't, even really deserve the name world order. And what we've seen in the wake of COVID-19 is really a collapse in that confidence. And these images here just represent a few examples. In the top left corner of the screen, you see the UN Security Council, which has been completely absent from the response to COVID-19. And that's pretty astounding when you think about it. This body, it's supposed to be the coordinating body of the great powers of the United Nations, really has been completely absent from this entire crisis. On the right, you even see the World Health Organization, which is created obviously for exactly pandemics like COVID-19, has become a political football. Initially, a lot of accusations that the WHO was shilling for China, wasn't giving enough respect to Taiwan, who's done obviously an amazing job handling the COVID pandemic. And of course, now with the Trump administration in the United States ending its relationship with the WHO and defunding the organization. And this is quite significant given that the United States accounts or has accounted in the past for a large share of WHO funding. And then the bottom left hand part of the screen is probably the one that was most shocking to me and most troubling to me, was to see just how rapidly even countries within the EU started really just going their own way, not using the EU as part of their coordinating mechanism for COVID-19. And in March, as we saw sort of this reestablishment of borders within the Schengen area that was not coordinated at all. So far, in the months since, the EU has done a pretty better job, I think, of having some coordination, and we're starting to see some of those borders reopen. But really, when you see just such dislocated decision making, you start worrying about how much staying power some of these institutions have. And really, if you're trying to look at sources of why this confidence has really collapsed, this map really says it all. What do we see on this map? Really, with the exception of a few regions, sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Southeast Asia, the entire world is grappling with COVID-19, and it's really arresting all of our lives in an unprecedented way. And really, the countries that wind up looking the worst are the great powers. The United States, has the dubious distinction of having the most COVID-19 cases and deaths. But Russia, isn't far behind. China, obviously, where the pandemic started and has suffered quite a bit from the pandemic as well. And of course, the EU. So the great powers, most of all, perhaps, look poor in this situation. And unlike other sort of big transition points, maybe not even ones that ushered in new world orders, but look at, the fall of the Berlin Wall, where it was sort of seen as there was a clear winner in the West and a clear sort of loser in communism, or World War II for sure. The United States and its allies were the winner and fascism was the loser. Here, everyone really, but with the exception of a small number of countries, is seen as a loser. And so with all the great powers looking like losers in the context of COVID-19, really the confidence in the world order is no longer existing. And the result of this is really why I think that we're on the brink of a transition point. And when I say a transition point, I don't necessarily mean, one conference or something like that. I think it's really a 1 to 5 year period that we're entering in which the contours of the new order are going to take shape. And the reason for that is that we start seeing political space, not only in the United States, but I think also in Europe, in places like China, in Russia, all around the world, political space for really big change. And it's rare enough in one country like the United States to have that type of political space opening up for really ambitious and new policy proposals, but it's infinitesimally rare, for all of that political space to happen across countries at the same time. So as we enter this period in which the new order will be built, I think it's really critical for us to look back at the last two major transition points in 1919 and 1945, because these transitions are quite rare. And once they happen, as I mentioned before, they tend to be fairly durable. So it's really important for us to not mess this opportunity up and to try to understand what went wrong in 1919, which was really a failed attempt to build a new order, and what went right in 1945. So 1919 really, was a disastrous, the birth of a disastrous New World Order. We see during the interwar period, the Great Depression. You see the soup lines on the left. You saw the League of Nations. The United States never joined it. Very quickly sort of became irrelevant with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, and then of course the rise of fascism and in particular Nazism, and truly the destruction of that order, and the beginning of World War II, which was even worse than the First World War. But by contrast, the post-1945 order ushered in 7 decades marked by peace and prosperity, plummeting violent deaths, and world GDP expanding nearly 80-fold. So really the critical question we have to ask is, how can we emulate the successes of post-1945 and avoid the errors of post-1919? So the first lesson is really to plan early. And this is one area where it may seem basic, but it has some really important consequences. Post-1919, Woodrow Wilson, when he showed up at the Paris Peace Conference in January 1919, none of the principles underlying the new order had already been agreed. And so you had Wilson, you had Clemenceau, you had David Lloyd George with totally different visions of what the post-war order should look like. And that sort of lack of pre-planning and sort of hastily designed order led to an order that really wasn't up to the challenges of the coming era. By contrast, FDR really took a very different approach. The Atlantic Charter, in which FDR and Churchill, you see them right now on a ship in which they were issuing the Atlantic Charter, was done in August of 1941. So that's months before Pearl Harbor, months before the United States even entered the war. The Bretton Woods Conference, which set sort of the outlines of the post-war economic system, was done in 1944. So a year before, more than a year before the end of the war. And so this pre-planning allowed sort of, the critical debates on ideas of principles to happen before really, it was time to get on with life and start rebuilding. And I think the important lesson for us now is that leaders need to start planning ASAP. And that doesn't mean, hatching out a whole new successor to the UN or a successor to the G7, tomorrow. What it really means is coming together to talk about principles. The first question we have to ask is, what do we want the world order to achieve? What are the sort of basic goals of the order? And as you see here, this image of a G20 Zoom call. I think it's important for world leaders to have these conversations, but I think it's not enough. It's not sufficient for world leaders to have these conversations. We also need conversations amongst civic leaders, amongst NGOs, amongst just regular citizens, businesses. And I think that sort of people power is just as important as the power of leaders right now, because by and large, a lot of these leaders aren't looking so good in the wake of COVID-19. And I think, as we're seeing even right now with the protests in the United States in the wake of the brutal killing of George Floyd, and there really is quite a bit of influence people can have in setting these agendas when they actually decide to. So the second lesson is one that's quite difficult, because sometimes it really goes against human nature, which is just to avoid the blame game. It's natural when a crisis like COVID-19 happens to try to find scapegoats. No one wants to, own up to a crisis that has killed 100,000 plus Americans. I mean, it's really awful. But it's really important to avoid that. I mean, if you look at the post-1919 world order, blame was kind of at the heart of the order, right? I mean, Georges Clemenceau came to the Paris Peace Conference really with the major goal of trying to figure out how to make Germany pay for the war, not only in the form of reparations, but territorial concessions, and actually formally accepting war guilt. And whether or not Germany was responsible for World War I, certainly those harsh terms and really the focus on blaming Germany sowed the seeds for the rise of Nazism. And I think it didn't really wind up serving any of the allies post 1919 to have such a punitive peace. Post 1945 was the totally opposite type of a situation. Germany, if anything, was more obviously at fault for starting World War II than it was in starting World War I. And yet the approach of the Allies was to rebuild Europe, including Germany, and really trying to make friends out of former enemies, right? And what do we have now? We have Germany and Japan, who were America's enemies in World War II, as two of the most important U.S. allies and really paragons of democracy. So I think the lesson here is that America should be generous in aiding post-pandemic recovery efforts around the world. And that really starts with public health and ending the pandemic. For all of the faults of America's healthcare system, and there are many, America's pharmaceutical research and sort of drug development and sort of high-end medical capabilities really are among the best in the world, if not the best in the world. And it is incumbent upon U.S. leaders today to find ways to leverage those incredible resources, not just to quell the pandemic domestically, but really around the world. And we've seen troubling signs from the current U.S. administration that instead of looking at global efforts to end the pandemic, it's really about how do we hoard these benefits for America. And of course, the fallacy there is with a disease as transmissible as COVID-19, until the pandemic is contained everywhere, it's not contained anywhere. And I think the important point here is that nothing will determine the moral authority America has in shaping the post-pandemic world more than the role America plays in ending the pandemic. So I think it's really incumbent upon US leaders to play a major role in bringing this crisis to an end. And I think the second way that America should be generous is just to fund the new order. I think the last international affairs budget, which covers my former employer, the State Department, the U.S. Agency for International Development, all U.S. foreign assistance, was $56 billion, which sounds like a lot, but it's a pittance relative to the trillions and trillions of dollars we've already spent now to try to dig the country out of the coronavirus abyss. So I think the very basic lesson here is that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and that American leaders should really not only come up with these ideas and to help build the institutions of the new order, but really put their wallets behind the new order and fund it to ensure that we don't face another COVID-19-like situation in the near future. And then the final lesson of history of the last two transitions is to build domestic consensus. And I think this is the hardest one to accept maybe and to envision today in our hyper-partisan environment in the United States. But it's a really important one, and I think it's, we'd be fooling ourselves if we didn't bring it up. So 1919, Woodrow Wilson, spent very, very little effort. He was a Democrat. He spent very little effort bringing Republicans on board to his peace plans. He didn't bring a single prominent Republican with him to the Paris Peace Conference. And in the process, he not only sort of iced out the more radical isolationist wing of the Republican Party, but even the moderate internationalist wing, led by people like Henry Cabot Lodge, a senator from Massachusetts. And the result, as you probably know, is that when the Treaty of Versailles came before the US Senate, it was defeated 53-38. And the United States never joined the League of Nations. And I think this is seen largely as one of the original sins of the post-1919 order. By contrast, FDR and Harry Truman, much more astute, I think, politicians than Woodrow Wilson, really focused early and often on building this domestic consensus. And the result was a resounding victory domestically for a lot of their initiatives. And just to take one example, when the UN Charter went before the US Senate, it passed 89-2, so overwhelming majority in favor of the UN Charter. And so the lesson here is really that domestic consensus in the US is critical, because if you have one party build an order and then it says or build an institution that's then defunded by the next party, and sadly we've kind of seen that as a trend in US foreign policy in the last few few transitions, with the Trump administration leaving the JCPOA and the Paris Agreement. It's really important for us to try to find ways to actually galvanize domestic support on both sides of the aisle for this new order. And I think there's, while it is going to be hard, I do think there's reason to believe it's not impossible. And that's because if you look beyond sort of, titles of Democrat or Republican on specific issues, there's actually quite a bit more agreement in the American political space than you'd think. So one that really even surprised me when I saw this, some of you may know the Chicago Council on Global Affairs does an annual survey about US perspectives on what America's role in the world should be. And in the most recent survey from 2019, about 70% of Americans said that they support an active US role in the world. And the astounding thing about that is it's the second highest tally ever in the history of this survey, which dates back, I believe, to the 1950s. So we're actually at peak, or near peak American support domestically for an active US role in the world. And then even on specific issues, there's quite a bit of agreement. So 2 in 3, it's 67% of Americans support policies to combat climate change, and a full 80% consider cyber threats, cyber attacks to be a critical threat. So, the broader lesson there is just that, if we can sort of get past the partisanship and just really focus on the issues of what we want the new order to achieve, there is some reason to be optimistic that that America can sort of get behind a new world order. So the last piece of, the last thing I want to talk to you about today is really just what this new order could look like. And, your guess is as good as mine. There's some forecasting that goes into this. I'll admit that some of this is also just my own opinion of what I think the new world order should look like. But I'm really excited to talk to you about, sort of looking ahead and seeing if we can think about what a new order might look like. So first, I want to talk about what a lot of people think might happen. And this is not my opinion, this is what others have sort of come up with. And I'd say the foreign policy community has split into 2 big schools of thought. One is basically saying that we're not moving toward a new world order, we're moving toward something that looks more like disorder. And some very important international relations scholars have written in Foreign Affairs and other places that we're actually moving toward an entropic world order, that the scientific concept of entropy, in which we just constantly are leading toward more disorder. And I think the argument is that the media space being so fragmented and power being dispersed amongst non-state actors is leading to this change. And I fundamentally disagree with this. I understand where it's coming from, but I think I would counter sort of the entropy analogy with a quote from Aristotle, which is that nature abhors a vacuum. And what I mean by that is that the question isn't whether we will have order, it's at what level will order be established. We even have seen in the United States, the federal government has not done much really to lead a coordinated response to COVID-19. Instead of seeing complete disorder, what we've seen is individual states and governors try to create more orderly processes in their own jurisdictions. And as a result, we're seeing highly different consequences in some states that are managing COVID-19 a lot better than others. So I do think we're moving toward a new world order. The question is, how functional will this order be, and at what level will it exist? Another school of thought, very common, you'll see sort of amongst foreign policy scholars, is that we're moving towards something more closely resembling a Pax Sinica. So you've probably heard of Pax Romana, Peace of Rome, or Pax Britannica, Peace of Britain, Pax Americana, Peace of America. Pax Sinica would be sort of a new world order in which China is sort of setting the rules of the road. And there's reason to believe that this is happening. Of course, China is a rising great power, has had some success in creating new international institutions in recent years, including the AIIB, some of which have happened really even against the wishes of the United States. But I think this Pax Sinica vision overlooks the fact that people are smart, and have seen that China, was ultimately where the coronavirus started, that it spread by and large because of Chinese efforts to suppress early warnings of the coronavirus. And we're also seeing just some fundamentally troubling policies out of China, whether they be in the cyber domain, whether they be clamping down on businesses, whether they be the treatment of Hong Kong. And I think we're even already now seeing countries put forward mechanisms that seem to be defending against or sort of going against this idea of a Pax Sinica. The European Union has put forward a new China strategy. Just a week or so ago, Boris Johnson put forward the idea of a D10 or a group of 10 democracies to build their own 5G networks that aren't dependent on Chinese technology. So I think this Pax Sinica isn't what's going to come to pass. And I think what will come to pass is what we don't know yet, but will be based on the best ideas. The reason for this is, as sort of mentioned before, none of the great powers are going to emerge from COVID-19 as a clear winner. So what will sort of win the day are the best ideas. The coronavirus has forced us all to confront our shared vulnerability. I think it's not hard now that we're seeing the effect of a global pandemic on us for us to imagine what climate change could wind up doing to really disrupt our lives and other collective action problems. And I think with confronting this shared vulnerability, we're all open to good new ideas, and who knows where these will come from. I mean, of course, they'll require governments eventually to glom onto them and to endorse them. But in terms of the source of these ideas, I think it's still very much up in the air. So in terms of what the order could look like and how it could be structured, I want to sort of start with a fundamental premise, which is that every international order involves a trade-off between breadth and ambition. And what I mean by that is the broader the membership, if you have every country in the world, you almost invariably are going to have a very narrowly scoped ambition for the institution and for the order. And it makes sense, right? I mean, any of us, you put more of us in a room, there's probably less that we can agree on, right? We all see it. And I think probably the best example that we saw in the post-1945 order is the United Nations, right? The United Nations was both an incredibly broad, or is an incredibly broad institution, 193 members, and also really has a bailiwick that is very expansive, and yet we're constantly disappointed by the UN. We don't think the UN really delivers nearly as much as we think it should, and I think you can contrast that with the European Union, a much smaller institution, but really amongst like-minded democracies that has become almost a supranational entity, quasi state in and of itself with its own currency. So I think there's a critical trade-off between breadth and ambition, and that will sort of underscore some of the choices we'll have to make as we enter this new world order. And I think the way that leaders should deal with this trade-off is not to think about one holistic new order, but really to think about a two-level system. And what I mean by that is you have one level, which is the global level that incorporates all major global powers, and another level that is really just amongst like-minded democracies. And this might seem, extravagant or very different from what we had in the past, but it's actually not all that different, right? I mean, we had a two-level order for most of the Cold War, in which America and Western Europe and democracies in East Asia very much built their own system that was separate and apart from the rest. And it was really only in the post-Cold War era in which we sought to globalize that Western world order to really cover much of the rest of the world. So at the global level, as mentioned, this is an order that's very broad. So I think it's important for it to be narrowly scoped. And my recommendation would be for it to be focused squarely on collective action problems. Most important of them all, climate change, but also cybersecurity and pandemics. And it's really that at the global level, the order should be focused on problems that can only be resolved at the global level, right? I mean, there's just fundamentally no way we can defeat climate change if it's just the democracies of the world who are committed to confronting it. And then I think at the level of like-minded democracies, because this is a narrower group, it's a group that thinks about world problems and thinks about sort of norms and right and wrong in the same way, if not or similar way at least. They can be focused on much more ambitious and divisive problems. Disinformation, tax avoidance, inequality. Collective defense. Is something, obviously a Cold War. Something that came out of the Cold War in terms of NATO. How do we defend democracies against invasion from other countries or military aggression? I think we need to start thinking about collective defense against subtler threats, be it election meddling or disinformation. And it's really amongst like-minded democracies that we can think about that type of collective defense. And I also think it's amongst like-minded democracies that we need to start thinking about new economic compacts that go well beyond just trade agreements, and start thinking about how do we actually create more equitable economic growth in our societies, which I think is a shared priority of all of our democratic societies. And I think it's also in this group of like-minded democracies that we need to start thinking about an orderly and thoughtful retreat from globalization. So I think this one is difficult because it's really been almost a creed of American leaders for decades now that globalization is a good thing. I think what we're seeing is that while maybe on balance it's been good, it's had some very negative consequences on different parts of our society. I think some retreat from globalization is inevitable and warranted after the coronavirus, but I think it's really important for it to be done thoughtfully so that we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. And I think this orderly and thoughtful retreat from globalization in terms of creating alternative supply chains, perhaps for important goods like pharmaceuticals or for infrastructure, should be done amongst like-minded democracies. And this touches on the Boris Johnson D10 proposal that I mentioned a few moments ago. So just to sort of emphasize, there is a desire inherently to go back to normal, right? And nostalgia, to return to the life pre-pandemic. But really, I think it's important for us to accept that there is no going back to normal. Crises that are this sort of life-altering don't sort of just vanish after they happen. I put in this slide with the Zoom call here, which we're all on right now. And I think, while I personally miss seeing my colleagues in person and miss seeing my friends and family in person more, and really look forward to the day where I can, I think we also should accept that there are some things that will stay. And those things aren't necessarily bad and can wind up, actually creating a more equitable, more just society. The other thing is that, these transitions can be scary because there's no template to follow. The stakes are really high. But, none of us really have lived through or participated in other transitions between world orders. One of my favorite quotes from a former professor of mine, Donald Kagan, is that without history, we are the prisoners of the accident of where and when we were born. It's hard not to be, right? I mean, what we know is the reality we've lived in, which is part of the reason why COVID-19 took us all by surprise. We hadn't lived through the Spanish flu or any other sort of world-shaping pandemic. But I think with history, we can approach this transition point not with fear, but with some confidence and with some lessons for how we might make it ultimately a good transition for the world. And the last thing I want to leave you with before taking your questions is just to reemphasize the stakes. This isn't, a debate over some passing policy question that will no longer be relevant at the next news cycle. This is something that will, by and large, shape much of the history of our lifetimes and perhaps our children's lifetimes as well. And the question we have to ask us today is the coronavirus the sort of big crisis of our lives, or will we eventually remember COVID-19 as this century's world crisis 1 to a larger world crisis 2? And I think we all have a shared interest in ensuring that it's just world crisis, not 1 or 2, but the world crisis of our times, and that we can wind up ushering in many decades of peace and prosperity when the pandemic recedes. Well, thank you so much for listening to me, and I'm very excited to take your questions.
First of all, it's been super interesting. Thank you so much for taking your time to prepare with such quality and depth all the material you've been giving to us. And I wanted to, I have several questions, but we will let the public ask, of course. But first of all, there's the blame game topic that you were talking about during the presentation. They talk about how the US should be generous with the recovery efforts around the world. But also in your article in Politico, you mentioned China and you mentioned its public health system. Now, that to me seems very complicated given the current circumstances. So my question is, what needs to change in order for this to happen?
It's a great question. I think the thing that needs to change is really a sense of an appreciation of the fact that we won't be safe here at home in the United States until the rest of the world is also safe, right? And I think sadly, we may have to learn from experience. It's enough, it's one thing for public health officials to say that, so long as the pandemic is raging abroad, there's no way for it to be contained. But I think, what we're seeing sadly now, even with some states that decided to reopen perhaps hastily, is we're already starting to see a second wave of COVID-19 brewing in some states in America. And I think in order for us to have this intellectual shift, to start appreciating that, we don't just need to help, the United States quell the pandemic, but also help other countries around the world, is probably going to wind up seeing more of these waves happen over the next year. I think sadly, that's starting to seem inevitable. But I think once we sort of see that shift, and once we can appreciate that, the public health system and really the ability to contain the virus in even developing countries has serious consequences for the United States, which by the way, I'll mention, we have noticed in the past, right? I mean, it's why America has played such a big role in quelling the Ebola pandemic in parts of Africa, right? I mean, it's both for to be magnanimous, but it's also because if you have an uncontrolled pandemic anywhere, it's the nature of infectious disease that it goes across borders. So I think once we accept that, hopefully sooner rather than later, I'm hopeful that our leaders can step up and start being generous.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. And going to one of the points you also mentioned, it's the UN. Okay, the role of the UN in this discussion. We have some UN correspondents, some journalists that are based in New York and that cover and a good part of our organization covers the UN. So we want to know your insight on not only the UN, but maybe the multilateral organizations, World Bank, IMF, UN, as you mentioned. It doesn't seem that it's been working so well during this pandemic. So what can we learn of these mistakes, and can we really trust in these huge organizations that are using huge amounts of public funds? And what's your opinion on that? Are you unmute? Okay. I'm asking you to unmute.
Aha, thank you. It's a really, really good question. And I think there are two things that I believe that may seem contradictory, but I think that they sort of will hopefully help address your question. The first is that I agree with you that current international organizations are not working. It's a matter of fact, right? But the second point I want to make is that in order to properly address the challenges that we're inevitably going to face in the years to come, climate change, more pandemics, cybersecurity, you can't address them as individual nation states. It's just not thinkable, right? I mean, the idea that, you could have 200 independent states coming up with their own climate change policies without any coordination and somehow confront that monumental crisis, it's unthinkable, right? So I think what we're seeing is we still need international cooperation. I think we probably need it more than ever, but the current institutional structures are just not working. And so I think, the solution, hopefully, is that, this loss of confidence in the current structures doesn't mean that we're going to go to a, every nation for itself type of a system, but rather that, there's now this political space for new ideas, right? And the reason I sort of brought up this Boris Johnson D10 or 10 democracy proposal is that, when I originally wrote this Politico piece at the end of April, and I think it was published in the beginning of May, that was before Boris Johnson had put forward that idea, right? And whether or not that is the idea that winds up sort of, having the day and becoming sort of the basis of a new Council of Democracies, I don't know. But I think ideas like that signify that world leaders still think we need international cooperation. We just need new institutions, right? And so I think the space to watch in the next year is which ones of these ideas gain traction, which ones actually get off the ground. The D10, as Johnson sort of proposed it, is really about telecommunications networks, right? So it's fairly narrowly scoped, but as all the Europeans I think on this call know, the EU, which is probably the most ambitious of these organizations, started out as a coal and steel community, right? I mean, it almost doesn't matter what the initial issue is. What matters is the group of countries. And I think if we do see sort of a council of democracies or a group of like-minded countries coming out of this, I think that will be one of the most promising outcomes of this crisis, because it's something that's sorely missed, right? I mean, you see, the G7 is probably the closest we have, and yet the G7 doesn't include countries like South Korea. It doesn't include Australia. It doesn't include India. And also the G7 hasn't played as big of a role as the UN Security Council or some of the other institutions you mentioned. So I think that we still need international cooperation. We just need new mechanisms to make that happen.
Okay, thank you so much. Don't mute yourself because it's gonna ask me. Okay, perfect. So look, we already have some very interesting questions. So I'm gonna yield the floor to Jevin from New York City. I'm allowing her to talk. Let me see if we can hear her. Let me see.
Hello, Eddie.
There
Alex. Hi.
Hi.
I just want to know, it was very interesting, first of all. Thank you. You spoke very nicely, very articulately. I was just wondering, how long do you think it would take for a new world order to emerge?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think this is one thing that I don't want to be confusing about, because I think we are at a transition point, but a point doesn't mean it's going to be a moment in time. I think the time frame I gave was 1 to 5 years, but I think it could wind up even being more like 10 years, right? I think certainly in the next few years we're going to start seeing some of these proposals actually gain steam. But if you look at even the 1945 order, the liberal world order that we talk about so much, so of course you had the UN born right in 1945, but you didn't have the EU born until early 1950s. NATO obviously came in the late 40s as well, and some of these other institutions started being built. I think the most important first step is really just the principles. It's what do we want the world order to achieve, right? Which policies do we think we can just deal with at a national level? And for sure, there are many, right? I mean, not every issue needs to be internationalized, and I think it's a good thing for countries to have the autonomy to make their own decisions about what their social contract should look like. But the fact of the matter is, there are some of these issues that we just can't avoid international cooperation on. So my best guess, like I said, is 1 to 5 years. I think hopefully in the next 2 years, we'll start seeing some of these more ambitious proposals, at least around principles, around structures, gain steam. But I think it's going to be a process that takes years, and in retrospect winds up looking like one point. It winds up looking like a transition point, but it'll take a few years for sure. It's a great question.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. We're gonna go with Ana Rita Guerra she asked through the question and answer. So let me see. You are muted now, Anna. And if not, I'll read it. Let me see if Anna can jump in. Yes, we hear you.
Hi, Eddie. Hi.
Hi, Anna.
I'm in Los Angeles. It's super hot here. So you were talking about this like-minded democracies, and you kind of answered my question a little bit when you were talking about the D10 proposal of Boris Johnson. But my question is, so do you think that we will actually see a starting point, a treaty, something that is defined as the beginning of a new era, or not? Or is this just a set of an agreement here, an agreement there, and then 20 years from now we look back and we see this as the starting point?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it's going to be more of the latter, right? You know, as romantic as the idea of a Congress of Vienna or a Peace of Westphalia or, you know, Paris Peace Conference is, I'd be skeptical if the new order is born whole cloth out of one big meeting or one point. Certainly, I think we're going to need some of those types of summits, right? I know that candidate Joe Biden has called for a summit of democracies, right? That's something that is already sort of in the discourse, that if he were elected, he would call together this group of democracies. We've seen other similar proposals, and I think certainly, especially as it becomes more okay from a public health perspective for leaders to actually meet in person, start seeing some of those things happen. But I do think it's going to be the type of thing where historians 50 years from now look back on the period 2020 to 2025 or something like that as, you know, a period of new beginnings, but there won't be one single point. And I think that also is because we don't need one single institution, right? And one of the weird quirks, I think, of the 1945 order that wound up kind of being resolved just by, how institutions evolved, was that we actually kind of flipped this breadth and ambition thing on its head, right? We created the UN, which is the broadest of all institutions, and said, you have the most ambitious goals, right? You're doing everything, global peace, blah, blah, blah. Whereas, the EU, again, started as a coal and steel community, and NATO was just, protect Europe against Soviet invasion, right? And I think what we need is sort of the reverse now. We need like-minded democracies with very ambitious scope, broad scope, right? Everything from, deterring election interference to combating international tax avoidance to protecting labor standards. And then on sort of this broader level of 193 plus countries, it's really, we need to be very, very, very narrow. There's so little that you can have that many countries agree to, that if we just decide, okay, the number one thing we want at the global level is just, binding targets on carbon emissions, I think we'll wind up seeing a lot more success than what we currently see under the UN today.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Anna, and yeah, get some air conditioning. I'm worried.
Oh, I do. I have one. I have one, but it's so hot outside. You have no idea.
Oh,
and I'm here in LA too, so I feel you.
Oh yeah, 100 today. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh man.
Okay,
global warming.
Let's exactly. Let's keep going with. I'm gonna give the floor to Nancy Camo, who is our chairperson. I'm unmuting her. So let me see if we can hear Nancy.
Is that good?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. Thank you so much. Very interesting, very comprehensive presentation. My question is, in a recent communication with some leaders, world leaders that I very much respect, they seem to come to the conclusion that we're seeing a shift in a social orientation to away from, a socially involved communities into an economic-based order. And if that's the case, what does that do to institutions such as the UN that are predicated, obviously, on addressing issues in an aggregate sense?
Mm-hmm. So what can you just clarify what you mean by social issues versus economic issues?
Well, what I'm saying is, for instance, with the social issues, we're dealing with the environment, we're dealing with life as it is manifested in reality, as opposed to a business evaluation of society.
Yep. So it's a really important question, Nancy, and this is something I personally have done a lot of thought about in the last few months. You know, it's interesting. At the end of the Cold War, you know, we take ourselves back to 1989 and the early 90s. There was sort of this general sense that liberal democracy was sweeping the world, right? And a trend that we were all going to eventually, that it was unstoppable, right? And I think the one thing that I think is unfortunate and really striking in retrospect is that it seems like what was an even more robust trend at the time that is we're living with even on a greater scale today is this trend toward neoliberalism, this trend toward deregulation, this trend toward, you know, just decreasing tariffs, and, you know, Washington consensus, and, you know, government is not the solution, it's the problem. You know, sort of a lot of the ideas of Reagan and Thatcher that wound up being quite influential for decades after, after the Cold War as well. And I think what we've seen is really, I think, almost too much of an emphasis on what's good for corporations, what's good for businesses, and not enough emphasis on what's good for society, what's good for people. Prioritizing sort of aggregate GDP growth as opposed to, you know, equitable or growth or shared prosperity, I think has led to a lot of reversals of some of the gains that liberal democracy has made, right? I mean, including in the United States, right? I think what you're seeing on both the right and the left is a lot of it has to do with not with, you know, the fact that our corporations aren't doing well, or that, you know, I mean, by any measure, I mean, look, most of the most powerful companies in the world are still based in the United States. It's because that growth hasn't been shared equitably. Mm-hmm. So, you know, if what you're saying is right, and that we continue sort of down this path of just focused on, you know, economic growth for growth's sake, I'd be very surprised. And I think the reason I'd be surprised by that is if there's one sort of lesson of COVID. So, I mean, you know, it's hard to forecast this, but it's that we need, if anything, more state capacity, not less. And right, I mean, and there are some countries that are democracies that have done well against COVID. There are others that are less democratic that have done well against COVID. The one thing that has sort of unified these countries is that they've had robust state capacity, good public health systems, you know, insurance, the health insurance that covers everybody, you know, paid sick leave. So people who are sick don't think that they have to come into work and infect other people. And my hope is that that some of those issues that, you know, sort of, they're kind of economic, but they are also social, because they really affect how individuals live their lives. And you know, my hope is that those issues wind up coming to the fore post-coronavirus, because it's the only sort of clear trend we can see right now, that this neoliberalism really has failed quite abysmally. And, you know, it's time for us to think about what comes next.
Thank you. You're mute.
There you go. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I'm gonna mute you now.
Thanks, Nancy.
Perfect. So we're gonna go with our Deputy VP, Clarissa McNair. Okay, I'm allowing her to talk right now. And you have to unmute yourself as well. If Clarissa... Okay, if not, we're gonna go with Blair Zhang. Let me see. and then we can go back with Clarissa. When I unmute you, you have to unmute yourself too in order to proceed. Well, while we wait, I have some other questions. So we're gonna go. I'm gonna go a little bit more nationally wise. In the current administration doesn't seem to want to really fully cooperate with other countries, and for instance, we've even seen in some of the topics you really analyze and do research, like economic sanctions or tariffs. The current administration has even put some of them in historical allies, right? So how do you think, given that circumstances and President Trump will face this new order making, let's say, if reelected in November?
Mm-hmm. Sure. I think it would just be it's just plain untrue to think, you know, that the consequences of the 2020 election aren't immense for the future of the world order, right? I mean, I agree, Alex. I think what we've seen from President Trump so far is that he doesn't really believe in America's alliances, or he doesn't see the value in international cooperation. And so I am concerned that were Trump to be reelected, that we wouldn't see robust American involvement in the new world order, right? You might see something more similar to, you know, the early years of the interwar period, in which America really stood aloof from the League of Nations and other parts of the international order. But I think the thing I want to emphasize, though, is even if the US isn't involved, that doesn't mean that other countries aren't going to want to build a new order, right? I mean, we've seen, you know, I mentioned that I think the most important thing right now is international cooperation to end the pandemic, right? Through creating novel therapeutics, a vaccine. You know, we saw a very large pledging conference held by the Europeans, but with also participation from many other countries, in which the United States didn't participate. And so I think what we would wind up seeing if Trump is reelected, barring some sort of major change in the president's own perspective, which, you know, your guess is as good as mine if that's going to happen, is you'll see these ideas for a new world order come from other countries, be that, you know, countries in Europe and Asia, Africa, other parts of the world, South America, but also from civil society in the United States, right? So I'm not saying the US won't be influential. You know, I think one of the most interesting things about the protests in the wake of George Floyd's killing is that you're seeing protests all around the world. So clearly America, from sort of a soft power perspective, from a civil society perspective, still has resonance in other countries. So you could wind up seeing almost a circumstance in which, you know, American civil society participates in coming up with some of the ideas for the order, but it's really other countries that start building these institutions without the United States. And maybe it becomes a question of whether another US president, perhaps in 2025 or 2029 or some other time, winds up trying to join that order at that time in a formal way, right? And I mean, there's always peculiarities to America's involvement in the world, right? I mean, there are many treaties that the United States hasn't ratified that we still comply with. You know, American domestic politics, you know, has always been fractious to a certain degree. I think the real question is where will sort of these ideas come from? I think if Trump is reelected, it's highly unlikely they come from the White House in any formal way, but that doesn't mean they won't come from the United States through less sort of formalized channels.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Of course.
I'm going to let Mark Fishman to ask his question, because he wrote one at the Q&A chat.
So Eddie, I really have two questions. Number one, with what you're seeing in the European Union, with them closing borders, and obviously, you know, England leaving the Union, and you know, different states becoming more, call them fascist. What role do you see, first of all, do you think the European will continue, and what role do you see them having in this world order? And secondly, do you feel, as in the current world order, where there's one country, the United States, that's been the dominant player, do you see a world order where it will not be one country dominating?
Thank you, Mark.
Sure. I'm actually going to start with the second question, and then I'll loop back to the EU one. So, you know, I've seen this phrase US-led international order or unipolarity as sort of like American dominance, right? I think the important thing to realize, though, and I would guess that my European colleagues see this more than, you know, Americans, is that, you know, the world order was never fundamentally dominated by the United States, right? I mean, it was the US and the European Union, or at the time, the European community, was the West holistically that won the Cold War, right? It wasn't just the US that did so. And a lot of the ideas, even for the original sort of institutions of the post 1945 order, were come up with by the US, but also in concert with democratic allies around the world. So even though America's relative power isn't as great as it was in 1945, so 1945, I think America accounted for about 50% of global GDP. Today, it's about 25%. But that 25% hasn't been in secular decline, right? I mean, I think it was actually lower as a share of global GDP about 10 years ago. And as Europe sort of has a share of global GDP has gone down, America's has gone up, right? And of course, some potentially important democratic allies of the US, potentially India is one, you know, see their power increasing over time. So I think it's almost guaranteed that the new order will have multiple poles of influence. Certainly China will be influential. I think the EU will be influential. I think India will be influential. But I don't think that's as different from the previous order as you think. And I think if there was a period of quote unquote unipolarity or American hegemony, it was really in the 90s and immediate years after 9/11. And what we saw is, you know, the world doesn't like that. You know, the world doesn't like a world order in which America can just sort of make decisions unilaterally to invade other countries, right? And I think there's a reason why even many of America's democratic allies broke with the United States over the decision to invade Iraq in 2003. On the first question about the EU, I have always been and remain an optimist about the future of the EU. And I think that's because, you know, the European Union truly does add a huge amount of value to the lives of people in Europe. And despite its flaws, it's continually found sort of ways to evolve, and it's found workarounds basically to a lot of the quirks that it has over time. I think we're at a real inflection point with the EU. You know, for the first time, really, we've seen Germany come around to the proposal in Merkel's administration to do Eurobonds, to actually sort of, you know, collateralize EU-wide debt, sort of, and people calling this the Hamilton moment. At the same time, we've seen those decisions challenged in the German courts, right? So it's unclear exactly where that's headed, but I feel confident that the EU will persist and be stronger. And I think Brexit, you know, as an American, I very much would have preferred the UK to stay in the EU. You know, it's always great to have them there, but in a way, you know, the UK was never fully at home with its place in the EU, right? I mean, and there's potentially an argument that, you know, without the UK and without this sort of question of in or out Brexit looming over the EU, you could wind up seeing, you know, really more decisive moves towards supranationalism in the next few years.
Did you get
Okay.
your question?
Yeah.
Thank you, Mark, for your questions. I'm going to unmute Elena Lenza, whom I had the pleasure to actually meet during a IMF and World Bank assembly in Washington, D.C. I've been told she has a question. The floor is yours. Hi, Elena. Oi.
Yeah, can you hear me? Hola.
We don't hear you very well.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect. Thank
Oh,
you.
okay. I had to change something here. So hello to everybody. Hi, Alex. Nice to see you again. Hi
Yeah.
to Ana Rita, that we also work together for the Portuguese news agency. It was a very nice conference, and also made me realize that so much that I don't know about. So it was really nice. Thank you, Eddie. And I think my questions were already also discussed, and so I was just thinking, this is my input here, thinking, can we think about a world order that is not political? Because we know the world order in a political and economic way, where United States dominates a lot on, and then can China come or Russia comes? But I'm thinking, for example, in the artistic way, why is it, or the technological, why is it that everything that starts in the United States will boom? And it's not like if you are in Portugal, for example, you will be a great artist or you'll be very famous. So I don't know if that makes a lot of sense for you, and it's not your domain, but I was just thinking.
So I think it's a really fascinating question. It's not my domain, so I'll try to contain my my desire to go on and on about it. And what I'd say is, I actually feel optimistic in this sense, in terms of a cultural globalization persisting, even if we start seeing less, supply chain globalization. And my best example I have here is, look at the Oscars, right? We saw for the first time a foreign language film from South Korea, Parasite, winning the Best Picture, which is sort of the holy grail of achievement in the American film industry.
Yeah, but at the same time, all the world watches the Oscars, but it's only American, only the American movies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm not saying that that you're wrong. I think that for sure American cultural influence tends to be quite strong. I think also part of that is about the funding behind the arts in the United States, right? It's very well funded in the US. Hollywood obviously is a huge industry. I think English plays a big role in it, right? And that, for the fact that we sort of have this, American English is widely understood around the world.
Exactly.
One interesting question I have, and this I don't have an answer to, but I can't remember where I was reading about this recently, is, with some of these AI applications and natural language processing and sort of instantaneous translation becoming sort of more of a realistic thing in the near future, I do wonder if there will be more sort of cultural seepage from other countries into the US as well. I think certainly if sitcoms that are done in, produced in Romanian or Hungarian or some other language could be very seamlessly sort of put into English and translated for an American audience. You never know. But I do think money has a lot to do with it, right? And the arts in the US get a lot of funding, both from, from public sources, but also there's a huge domestic market for it.
Thank you.
Yeah, great question.
Obrigado, Elena. Obrigado.
Obrigada.
Okay, so we are we're running out of time. Very last question for you, Eddie, and thank you so much. This one is from Blair Zhang. She's not able to talk right now, so she says that she's quite concerned about Trump's decision to move U.S. troops out of Germany. And she says she appreciates if we could touch base a bit about what risks we are exposed to by this. Thank you.
It's a tough last question, and it's because it's a very important topic. I think there could be serious consequences. I think there's obviously no way for us to know exactly why Trump made this decision. There's speculation that it was made sort of by virtue of feeling snubbed by Angela Merkel and not wanting to participate in the G7 at Camp David. But whatever the reason is, I mean, what does it signal to the rest of the world? I think it signals that, you know, if you offend or, you know, President Trump, there can be real consequences to your security. I think, unfortunately, this isn't the first time we've seen it, right? I mean, we've seen it even in the impeachment proceedings around, you know, withholding security assistance to Ukraine. I think this one is quite serious, especially because Germany is, you know, one of the most important U.S. allies and really a linchpin of Euro-Atlantic security. And, you know, from what I can tell, it seems like Chancellor Merkel and Germany is sort of taking the approach that, you know, they don't want to deal with Trump until after the election. And I understand that because, you know, really for the duration of his administration, President Trump hasn't been particularly friendly to U.S. allies, and he's more often thrown U.S. allies under the bus in favor of, you know, U.S. adversaries. And, you know, I think it only makes sense for a foreign leader to say, look, I'm not going to try to extrapolate from this. I'm not going to engage President Trump. We'll see if you know, get another 4 years. And what that signals to me as an American, it's sad in a way in that, you know, one of our allies would be treated like that. But at the same time, it shows that there is some hope that Trump's policies won't have this enduring negative consequence on how allies view America. And I think it's only history will tell whether Trump winds up being an anomaly or whether you know, Trump winds up being symbolic of a broader trend that persists in American politics.
Okay, yeah, that was a tough one to finish our lecture, our discussion today. Edward Fishman, we really appreciate you joining us. It's been a pleasure. Everybody is so happy that you were able to join us. And we hope to see you soon and hopefully in real life.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alex. And thanks so much to everyone for your excellent questions. It's really fun for me to be able to hear your own opinions. And I hope some of you will start writing about the New World Order because we need good ideas from everywhere.
Okay, we'll do. I'm sure we will do. Okay, I think Thanos will end the meeting, or I'll end it myself because I'm the host now, so I have the power. Okay, well, thank you so much and see you soon. And stay safe. Yeah. Thank you. Bye-bye.